There's something deceptive about tropical silence. By day, the Guadalcanal jungle appears almost peaceful. The hot air, the heavy scent of damp earth, the deep shadows beneath the palm trees. But when night fell between October 24th and 25, 1942, the jungle transformed into a black maw, from which shadows emerged one after another, slowly, silently, as if dissolving into the darkness. The American Marines knew the Japanese only attacked at night, and they knew that if they broke through, they would break through en masse. The soldiers of the 1st Marine Division sat in the darkness, listening to every sound. They could hear the quiet drip of water on leaves somewhere, the snap of a twig, the muffled thump of a heart. And in this complete darkness, on a narrow stretch of line manned by only a single machine gun crew, stood the man destined to hold that line single-handed. His name was John Basilone. That night, he would become one of the most famous Marines in the history of the United States. That night, he and his machine guns would be the last line between a Japanese breakthrough and the destruction of an entire American battalion. That night, he would do something that could never be repeated. But the road to this fight began long before he first heard the sound of Japanese gunfire. He was born on November 4, 1916, in Buffalo, New York, to a large family of Italian immigrants. The Basilone household was noisy and crowded, but never empty. John grew up not in luxury, but in warmth. 9 brothers and sisters meant constant elbowing, the ability to laugh, make noise, argue, and defend. He was the 8th child. From childhood, John was distinguished by one strange trait, a quiet determination. He was never a braggart. He never spoke loudly of his dreams. But as relatives recalled, once he decided on something, that was it. It couldn't be changed. As a teenager, he left school and began working. In a laundry, in warehouses, as a truck driver. But one passion stood out above all others. He loved running, and he ran fast, really fast. It was said he could run for miles without even getting out of breath. This would later save lives, many. At 20, he decided to volunteer for the Army. This was before the war. He enjoyed the service, the rhythm, the discipline, the gun in his hands. None of it was a burden. After leaving the Army, he could have lived peacefully, but then the war came. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, and America entered World War II. John never doubted for a moment he was joining the United States Marine Corps. It was the Marines who were the first to stop the Japanese advance in the Pacific. The Marine Corps' recruiting course was brutal. Instructors wrung everything unnecessary from the recruits: laziness, doubt, weakness. John remained calm, silent, gritting his teeth. He completed training marches with ease, performed well on the shooting range, and always moved forward in hand-to-hand combat. Soon he was sent to a specialized machine gunnery course. The heavy-mounted Browning M1917 and M19 pistols were weapons that could change the course of a battle. A machine gunner had to know the weapon down to the last screw, be able to fire continuously, carry 20-30 kilograms of iron and water for cooling, fire even when the barrel was red hot. John was the perfect fit. He was strong, resilient, and most importantly, cold. Then came the first deployment to the Pacific Ocean. Then came the landing on an island that America hadn't even considered important before. Guadalcanal. There the story will begin that will make him a legend. When American ships approached Guadalcanal in August 1942, none of the Marines fully understood where they were being taken. On maps, the island was a tiny speck in the vast Pacific Ocean, but strategists knew this tiny speck could change the course of the war. The Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal. If it was completed, they would be able to intercept American convoys, bomb Australia, and block the naval advance. The American command made a decision to strike first. The day was hot, the air humid, as if you could drink it. John Basilone stood on the deck, leaning on the railing, and looked out at the island. The tropical forest, the mist over the hills, the smoke trails, everything seemed alien, wild. There were no cities, no roads, no civilization here, only the green maw of the jungle. "What a hole," said the Marine next to him, pulling down his sweaty collar. "Better a hole than a Japanese airfield," John responded. The landing was surprisingly peaceful. American Marines became the first Allied troops to land on the island, where the Japanese weren't expecting an attack. Long lines of soldiers walked across the sand, the waves brushing their boots. Machine guns rattled somewhere behind them, but there was almost no resistance. Basilone carried some of the machine gun equipment and smiled mockingly at his comrades. Did you think the machine gun would run for itself? No one knew yet that in a couple of months it would be the Browning in his hands that would hold the line when everything around him collapsed. The Americans quickly occupied the unfinished airfield, Henderson Field. They had barely secured their positions when the war began again. Now the Japanese were trying to retake the island at any cost. At night, soldiers heard the deep roar of airplane engines. During the day, the roar of artillery. In the evening, the buzzing of mosquitoes. To fall asleep, you had to be so tired that you stopped hearing your own thoughts. John was used to sleeping for hours at a time, 2 at most. A platoon of machine gunners was always stationed near the most vulnerable areas of the defense. They went where, as they said, it would be hot. The commanders knew that the line where the Browning machine gun was located was the line that would hold. John was strict but fair. He once told a young Marine, "If you're going to be afraid the right way." "How so?" "Without losing your head." The guy laughed then, and 2 weeks later he died. There, on Guadalcanal, people grew up in a day. The island didn't just shoot it, killed all by itself. Malaria, dysentery, nasty flies landing on wounds, stale water. Food was constantly in short supply, and the ammunition they brought was just enough to survive until the next night. Sometimes John would watch soldiers, broken by the heat, simply sitting with their eyes closed, clutching their helmets. He would come over, clap them on the shoulder and say, "Are you still here?" "Yes." "Then get up. As long as you stand, you live." The war wasn't a front line here. It was in every sleep-deprived day, in every sun-baked step, in every rustle that turned into fear. A little later, the first real attacks began, or rather, attempted attacks. Japanese soldiers often moved silently, hiding in the jungle, trying to encircle American positions. They were experienced, fast, armed with Arisaka rifles and Type 96 light machine guns. They rarely surrendered, and the way they attacked at night frightened even veterans. Basilone first found himself under Japanese nighttime attack in September. He sat at his machine gun, his fingers slipping from sweat and his eyes aching from the strain. First there were shouts, then the drumbeat of the Japanese troops, then complete silence. "Damn," the machine gunner whispered nearby. "They're playing ghosts again." When the Japanese appeared, no one heard them. They simply emerged from the darkness, and the fire began. A Browning M1917, liquid-cooled, heavy, loud. The Basilone sector was illuminated by flashes. The machine gun fired short bursts. Shell casings rained down on everyone's feet. "To the left!" they shouted at him. "I see it!" But the attack was small. Reconnaissance. The Japanese will save their first real breakthrough attempts for October. John's position was on one of the narrowest defensive lines, barely 150 meters wide. If the Japanese broke through, they would reach the airfield. If the airfield fell, all of Guadalcanal would be lost. John understood that there was no retreat here. "If we're wiped out here," he told his men, "no one will give us a second line. It will all end right here on this earth." They nodded. They knew. This wasn't pathos. It was fact. Every day intelligence reported, the Japanese are bringing up forces, pulling together artillery, preparing for a massive night attack. The Americans strengthened their positions. They dug new trenches, hauled logs, camouflaged machine guns, and laid communication lines. And all this is happening under tropical downpours. One evening, John noticed that the young men were shivering, not from the cold, but from anticipation. He sat down next to me, took off his helmet, and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Guys," he said, "this is going to be tough. I won't lie to you, but you're not alone. We're holding this line together, and as long as we stand here, no one will get past us." Someone quietly asked, "Sergeant, what if there are too many of them?" John replied, "Then we'll shoot until we're left without hands." It wasn't a metaphor. He was saying exactly what he intended to do. By the evening of October 24th, 1942, the sky was covered with black clouds. The air became heavy and sticky. It smelled of rain and something else metallic, like before a major thunderstorm. American intelligence reported, the Japanese are moving. A lot, entire regiments. At 10:01 p.m., the soldiers heard the first sound. Distant, low, like the breath of the ocean. Japanese war horn. Someone said, "It's begun," and the darkness before them came to life. The darkness thickened so much it was almost tangible. The jungle ahead became a solid black wall. The sky was low and heavy, as if hanging over the earth. The air was filled with a silence filled with electric anticipation, so dense that it seemed as if time itself had slowed down. And suddenly, a sound. One. Drawn out, low, like the groan of a huge animal. Japanese signal horn. He tore the night in half. "They're coming," someone whispered. But words were unnecessary. Everyone already knew. A few seconds later, footsteps were heard. Quiet, cautious, but there were too many of them for the jungle to conceal them. One of the Americans raised a hand, as if trying to stop the thought, to hold back the fear. John stood by the M1917 machine gun, checking the belt. The evenly spaced chains of cartridges gleamed in the dim light of the camouflage lamp. He said briefly, "Get ready." The next second, the jungle in front of them was ablaze with rifle flashes. The Japanese attacked. A cry was heard from the left. "Contact! Contact!" And everything around exploded into chaos. Japanese soldiers burst out of the darkness, some almost running, others crawling along the ground. There were many of them, too many for the single company defending this area. John gripped the machine gun handles. "Tape!" he shouted. The machine gunner next to him handed over the belt, his hands shaking. Basilone pulled the trigger. The Browning roared, a heavy, low, powerful sound that pierced the night. Bursts cut through bushes, trees burst into flames, men fell. Each shot sent a thump through their shoulders. Shell casings fell to the ground, instantly glowing red hot. But the Japanese did not retreat. They accelerated. Some ran straight toward the machine gun, shouting and waving their rifles. Others lay in the shadows, crawling sideways, trying to get around it. John fired in short bursts, saving the barrel. He knew that if it overheated, it would be the end. On the right, the Marines also opened fire, but they were outnumbered by the Japanese in the first few minutes. The dense fire from the Japanese infantry literally pinned the Americans to the muddy ground. A nearby machine gun emplacement was blanketed with grenades. 2 Marines were killed instantly. The third screamed, clutching his torn side. John heard him and realized that he was the only working machine gun point left in the entire sector. The assault intensified. Shouts and commands in Japanese, sharp and rapid, resonated across the entire front. Flashes of light shattered the darkness. The figures of soldiers flickered like shadows in the hellish gloom. Several Japanese reached the wire and tried to cut it. John swung his machine gun around, fired a short burst, and the shadows fell. But new ones immediately took their place. To the right, one of the Americans shouted, "It's overheating! The barrel is red!" John saw his own trunk begin to glow a dull crimson. The cooling water was boiling. Steam rose in white jets. "Let's continue," he barked. "As long as they shoot, we'll stand still." After half an hour of fighting, ammunition began to run out. "Sergeant, that's all," the Marine shouted, holding up the last box. John didn't hesitate for a second. He jumped up, grabbed the empty box, and ran to the rear. Under fire, across open ground with no cover or camouflage, bullets pounded the ground, the trees, the branches above his head. One passed so close he heard it whistle past his ear. Another knocked his helmet off his head, but he didn't stop. Having reached the ammunition depot, he grabbed boxes of bundles of cartridge belts, each weighing more than 10 kilograms, and ran back. When he returned, he was met with the stunned gaze of the young machine gunner. "Are you alive?" "For now, yes." "Load the feed." He returned to the machine gun and opened fire again. The second wave of Japanese advanced more closely. They shouted, raised their blades, and some rushed forward with grenades. From the left came a voice, "They're breaking through! John!" Basilone turned his fire. A burst of fire pierced the darkness. Men fell one after another, but others took their place. One of the Japanese almost reached the trench, but Basilone hit him on the shoulder with the barrel of a machine gun, and then fired at him point blank with a pistol. "Hold on," he shouted. "We're not retreating." The Browning groaned from overheating. The barrel was so red that you couldn't touch it with your bare hands. The skin would peel off instantly. Water vapor erupted in spurts, as if the machine gun were breathing. "Sergeant, it's about to jam." "Then you'll shoot through my hands if you have to," John replied. The Americans were becoming fewer. The Japanese were never fewer. And then something happened that would later be written about in reports, and that historians would cite 80 years later. To keep the fire going in all directions, John Basilone began to pull the machine gun in his arms, changing its position under continuous fire. His bare hands touched the metal. The heat burned through his skin, but he continued, gritting his teeth. "Sergeant, this is war. Get to work." He pulled the machine gun as if it weighed not 20 kilograms, but a feather. By this point, 3 hours of continuous fighting had already passed. Sweat poured into my eyes. My hands trembled. My ears rang with the endless gunfire. But Basilone stood, and the Japanese couldn't figure out, how many machine guns were there? How many people were there? Why wasn't that spot silent? They thought there was a company there, and there he stood. The Japanese no longer advanced in waves, but in a stream. They seemed as endless as the night itself. Every minute brought new soldiers, and every meter in front of Basilone's machine gun was strewn with bodies. The Browning's barrel was so hot that its glow pierced the darkness. The metal changed color, turning almost white from overheating. Water vapor erupted in spurts, as if the machine gun were suffocating. John no longer felt the burns. The skin on his hands was stuck together, and blisters had formed on his forearms. But he continued to squeeze the trigger, alternating short bursts and single shots to avoid prematurely killing the barrel. A dead machine gunner lay on the ground nearby. The other surviving soldiers took his place and fell one after another. Blood soaked into the mud, turning the soil into a sticky, viscous mess. It smelled of gunpowder, burnt oil, and human flesh. Every few minutes, John would shout, "Tape! Tape!" But there are almost no ribbons left. One Marine, a very young one, handed him a box. "This is the last," he said in a trembling voice. John exhaled. "Then we'll survive until dawn on this one." At some point, the Japanese changed tactics. They stopped attacking broadly. They began pressing in one direction, directly toward John's sector. First he heard footsteps, then shouts, then the metallic clang of blades on wire. They threw themselves at the barbed wire, trying to tear it apart with their hands, and lay down with their bodies so that others could walk over them. "Are they pushing their own way?" someone said, amazed. "Yes," John answered shortly, "and they will continue to do so as long as we breathe." He turned the machine gun and fired a long burst. The Japanese front line collapsed, but the next ones were already on the way. Suddenly, one of the Americans shouted, "Sergeant, they're going around." And indeed, the Japanese were beginning to creep up on the flank, exploiting the shadows and gaps between the trees. John let go of the machine gun and grabbed an M911, the standard Marine pistol. When a Japanese soldier jumped out brandishing a bayonet, Basilone fired 3 shots at point-blank range. The soldier fell, but 2 more were already climbing up behind him. John hit one with his elbow, the other with the butt of his gun. It was pure rage mixed with survival. He pushed the body away, grabbed the machine gun with both hands as if he were picking up a child, and opened fire again. The fire was so dense that the barrel vibrated in my hands. Shells flew, bouncing, burning my clothes. The machine gun shook, as if protesting being pushed beyond its limits. But the Japanese kept advancing. Tens, hundreds. Later they would count. On his site alone, there were more than 100 bodies. One of the Marines shouted, "Sergeant, we can't hold out any longer. There are too many of them. We need an order." John's answer was calm. "My order is to shoot. As long as we stand, we live." The Marines sobbed and loaded a new belt. At one point, the Japanese approached so close that machine gun fire became useless. John realized it would be hand-to-hand combat. He grabbed the machine gun by its hot body. The leather instantly sizzled and turned it, pointing it down, straight at those rushing along the wire. He fired at an angle, point blank, almost into their faces. The screams merged into a single chorus of pain and rage. The Americans nearby screamed too, fighting back with bayonets. Someone shouted, "They're climbing over bodies, damn it! They're climbing over bodies!" John fired the last burst. The tape ran out. He threw the machine gun to the side and, barely touching the ground with his chest, crawled to the nearest gun. There lay a machine gunner from another crew, buried under a body. He pulled an M1919 machine gun from under his body, heavy as a sack of wet sand, and dragged him back. Bullets whistled around. Someone screamed his name. Someone called for a doctor. Someone prayed. But John moved, clutching the machine gun to his chest like a soldier clutching a banner. Returning to his position, he loaded a new machine gun and immediately fired a burst. On the left, a Japanese soldier reached the trench and plunged his bayonet into one of the Americans. The Marine fell. John turned the machine gun and fired. The bayonet was thrown back along with the body. The battle continued. Time turned into a dark swamp, incoherent, viscous. Only gunshots, screams, flashes, and suddenly a pause. The first silence of the night. As the first gray rays of light began to break through the tropical fog, John looked up from his machine gun. Hundreds of bodies lay before him, some in Japanese Army uniforms, others in the green uniforms of the Marine Corps. He turned slowly. Only a few survivors stood nearby, people with empty eyes, burnt hands, and shaking fingers. One of them whispered, "Sergeant, we are alive, because of you." John didn't answer. He looked at his hands. They were burnt, bloody, and dirty. He simply said, "We held the line. Later, the command will establish the facts." The Japanese attacked with 2 to 4 battalions. The defended area was about 150 meters wide. Basilone personally, O supported the work of 2 machine gun crews. O ran under fire for ammunition. O fought in hand-to-hand combat. O did not leave the position for more than 7 hours. O held a line through which the entire Japanese regiment could have passed. He will be awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest U.S. award. But he himself will later say, "I was just doing my job. The real heroes were out there that night." The morning after the great night on Guadalcanal was strange. Too quiet, too calm. The first rays of sunlight were barely touching the ground, and the fog still hung in white wisp between the palm trees. It smelled of dampness, smoke, and death. People walked slowly, as if their legs were filled with lead. No one spoke loudly, sometimes in whispers, more often in half-sentences. John Basilone stood by his machine gun, the very one that had held the line all night, the one he'd carried in his arms like a banner. It looked different now. The barrel darkened from overheating, the water jacket cracked, the metal cracked like an old boiling cauldron. The sergeant ran his hand over the body. It wasn't a weapon, it was his comrade, the one who had survived with him. There were bodies lying nearby. Lots of bodies, and among them are his guys. Those who trusted him with their lives, those whom he promised to get out alive, those who did not see the dawn. He stood there for a long time until someone quietly touched him on the shoulder. "Sergeant, command calling." John turned around. There was no emotion on his face, only fatigue. In the following weeks, the Americans tried to establish some semblance of normality. But there was no normality on Guadalcanal. Every day brought new battles, new attacks, new wounded. And only by February 1943 was the Japanese army forced to withdraw. Basilone became famous instantly. Not because he bragged, he said almost nothing about himself. But people talked about him. Soldiers from neighboring units came to see the legend. Officers mentioned him at night around campfires. Newspapers in the United States began publishing articles about the sergeant who single-handedly stopped the Japanese breakthrough. But he himself felt empty. One day, one of the young fighters asked, "Sergeant, how did you survive?" John simply said, "I don't know." Because the truth was this: he didn't believe he was supposed to live after that night. When he returned to the United States, he was greeted as a hero. Orchestras, speeches, and crowds filled his audience. His name became a symbol of resilience. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest award in the United States. He stood in his dress uniform, holding the award in his hands and felt like an outsider. The general's words, the applause, the camera flashes, it all seemed false. He thought about those left behind in the mud of Guadalcanal, in the rain, in the rotten trenches. About those whose faces he saw in the last flashes of bullets. About those he could not save. And his heart sank silently. The command decided to use his fame to support war bonds. He was sent around the country, give interviews, speak at rallies, take pictures for posters. His face appeared in newspapers, magazines, and on large banners. Americans loved him, admired him, and thanked him. But a strange, painful emptiness was growing inside John. He walked across stages, across stands, across halls filled with people, and each time he saw not applauding citizens, but the eyes of his soldiers, tired, dirty, scared, dead. After one performance, he said to the commander, "I can't stand in front of people anymore. I'm a soldier. Send me back. Basilone, the country needs you here. My guys are fighting. I have to be with them." He was refused several times. He kept asking, persistently, unwaveringly, and finally the command agreed. He could have stayed in the United States. He could have lived out his life peacefully. He could have been a symbol, the face of victory, but he chose to return. Now he was a heavy weapons instructor in the Marine Corps, training recruits, young faces destined for hell. He yelled, made them dig, run, shoot, crawl until their elbows bled. A new recruit once asked, "Sergeant, why are you chasing us like this?" He looked into his eyes. "Because I want you to come home." February 21st, 1945. Iwo Jima is a small volcanic island covered in black sand. The Japanese defenses are among the most powerful in history. Underground tunnels, caves, fortifications. John landed with the 5th Marine Division. Bullets struck the sand with such force that it turned into black rain. Explosions razed the earth. Screams mingled with the roar of artillery. He ran ahead of the squad, leading the men. He didn't think about glory. He didn't think about medals. I only thought that I had to do what I had always done, protect those around me. He destroyed a machine gun emplacement, threw grenades, and pulled out the wounded under fire. And at the moment when he was trying to pull out another Marine, a mortar shell exploded nearby. Shrapnel pierced his chest. He fell. Black sand crunched beneath him. The sky was smoky and ragged. He tried to breathe, but the air was thinning. The Marine he was rescuing turned to face him. "Sergeant, hold on. Do your job," John whispered, and he closed his eyes. He was 28 years old. America learned of his death a few days later. Newspapers wrote, "Guadalcanal hero falls on Iwo Jima." He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The ceremony was attended by generals, veterans, ordinary people, mothers who have lost their sons, young Marines he trained. Many cried. Later, the following would be named in his honor: destroyer USS Basilone, barracks, streets, sports halls, military shooting ranges. And every year in his hometown they hold John Basilone Day. But for those who served alongside him, he wasn't a monument. He was a man, quiet, reserved, strong, terribly brave. Basilone's story isn't about glory. It's not about a medal. It's not about a newspaper article. This is the story of a soldier who stood where others fell, went where others were afraid, returned to where others sought to leave. This is the story of a man who didn't think about heroism. He simply did what he believed was right. And sometimes this is what makes a person a legend.